Hi, I'm Harrison Hurt, and I'm doing the April 2017 Public Forum topic analysis for the Champion Briefs. Before I dive in, make sure to get the Champion Briefs for an even greater depth of analysis than I can provide in this 20-minute video, and lots of fantastic real evidence. So, I'm very excited to be giving this topic analysis for you. April is a very important month with tournaments like NDCA and the Tournament of Champions, of course. And we have a very contentious but very interesting topic on our hands, which reads, Resolved, the United States ought to replace the Electoral College with a direct national popular vote. Okay, so first I want to start off talking about framework considerations. And I think the first question that you should ask yourself when you're looking at this resolution is, what is the goal here? Like, what is the goal of reform or of the election process in general? What are we trying to achieve, right? And I think that's central to helping you really frame your arguments in a way that matter, and for helping judges decide how to evaluate all of the competing arguments in any given round. So one goal might be for the process to be democratic, to either maintain its current level of democraticness and protect it from decreasing, or increasing the democratic nature of the topic, of the process. Sorry, but I think there's a couple questions you have to consider with this. I mean, this seems intuitive, right? But why really is the goal of election reform to make our process more democratic? So I think like the intuitive answer that people give is like, well, we live in a democracy and therefore we should have a more democratic presidential election. But realize this is very tautological, right? Like, furthermore, we also live in a democratic republic where the goal is not just to produce outcomes that the electorate directly wants, but outcomes that are good for the electorate. That's why we don't have every single person in the country vote on every single policy issue, because they're not informed enough to be able to make proper decisions. They have lives that they have to attend to, whether that's their work or whether that's raising children or whether that's any other kind of pursuit that they do. They cannot focus on policy issues to the same extent and detail that our policymakers are expected to. And that's why we elect representatives to make decisions on our behalf, who have a duty to stay informed and be mindful of the impacts of their policy. And that works far better than it would be to try and rally the entire country to make policy. So what does that mean? That means that necessarily something being slightly more or less democratic isn't necessarily harmful for the functioning of our government or even the nature of our democracy itself. There are some who argue that a proper democracy needs some undemocratic elements in order to work properly. And so I think just assuming that the goal of this topic is to make the process more democratic is kind of a bad assumption, for one, and it's something you need to warrant a lot more in depth, and you have to be able to weigh slight increases or slight decreases in democracy, or even large ones relative to our democratic process as a whole, to show why this really matters. Because in the grand scheme of our democracy, I think it begs the question of how much does the Electoral College really matter? We host hundreds of other elections for local, state, and federal officials, and this is just one of them. And admittedly, it is the highest office in the land, the President of the United States, but how much less democratic is a world really going to be with an election process changed in one slight way, right? Even if it is a significant way, right? How much less democratic is a world with or without the Electoral College, and how is that truly consequential? How is that something that truly matters in terms of the nature of the democratic process itself? So I think if you want to run some kind of framework that's based off of democracy, you need to answer a lot of questions that I've just described above. I think another goal that you can make the round is to produce a government that is better functioning, one that produces better policy outcomes. Why might this be true? I think, well, intuitively this promotes better livelihood for people, and that's what people truly want out of their better system of government anyways. And so I think that might be a little bit more straightforward in terms of like why that framework matters, and why you can say it produce like a better government produces the best options for the best people. I think what's more vague though is necessarily what does better mean. Some people think that better government only falls along partisan lines and forces you to take a stance one way or the other. But I think that we also know that some things are objectively bad, such as corruption and extreme radicalism, such as foreign governments influencing and infiltrating our process. And we also know that some things are objectively good and definitely better in terms of policymaking, such as better informed decisions, candidates that are highly detail oriented, candidates who truly care about the issues of the poor and the middle class, and etc. And so even if like at some points along the line there are issues that fall partisan, I think you can still say that like it is possible to produce a better functioning government that is irrespective of your politics, right? Because of issues that we see in our government that we can fix, that are bipartisan, or that do not necessarily affect like the stances that candidates take, but simply the quality of those candidates and the level of information they have, the level of intelligence that they have, etc. So I think like that's all I'm going to speak on in terms of framework considerations. I think there might be like other questions that you could ask and like frame the goal of electoral reform in different ways, but I think those two ways I've described above are probably going to be the most significant ways and the most major ways. And so now I'm going to talk a little bit about arguments that I think could probably fall on either side. And so I'll talk a little bit more about that when I get into them. So the first argument is about third-party candidates or independent candidates. So I think the story of this argument goes that the national popular vote gives third-party candidates a better chance, not just to win, but simply to make tangible gains. Because in the status quo, they almost never win electoral votes because they can't get enough votes in a single state to earn that state's electoral votes. But the national popular vote changes the metric of success that we gauge candidates by from electoral votes to direct votes, which are easier to accumulate a significant amount of, and that helps third parties gain viability over time and pose a greater threat to the two parties. It can also translate to down ballot races as candidates at lower levels of government become more inspired by growing third-party success at the presidential level, and a sort of movement that begins to form, and that like grows stronger over time. So why does this argument go to either side? I think the reason is because I think the impact is kind of ambiguous. So on one hand, if you were on the pro side, you could say that third parties can be good because they help keep the two parties in check, they make them more accountable. Even if third parties don't win any presidential election, the greater threat that they pose forces the other two parties to be more honest and beyond just the quote-unquote lesser of two evils. But I think third parties could also be bad because they could also be extremely radical, like the extremist parties that are influential in other multi-party democracies around the world. As their strategy, they could try to feed off of populism and radicalism, which would divide and polarize the electorate in order so that they gain their own following and make their own segment of voters larger, right? So I think like that's key. I think third parties, some people might say, have an incentive to divide the electorate, right? Because they need to form their own segment. They need to form their own plurality and group. So they inherently want to divide people. And the more parties that are jockeying for influence within our system, you could say the more different segments of our population are being, the more people of our country are being divided into different sects, which can act as a barrier to proper communication, to proper policy making, and dramatically increase social tensions. So I think that's very consequential. I think that could have serious negative drawbacks. But so I think you can definitely see why there's like two sides to this like necessary impact of third parties. And no matter how you run this argument, it comes down to having strong warrants and explaining why your vision of the world with the national popular vote is more correct with regards to this argument, which requires comparison of underlying logic behind both of these competing claims, that the third parties can keep the two parties in check, or that the third parties are going to polarize people. I don't think those two things are necessarily mutually exclusive, so you need to be able to weigh why one is more important than the other, or why one is going to happen more than the other, etc. And so that requires you to ask yourself and answer a lot of questions when you're crafting this argument, no matter how you run it, right? So one thing you're going to have to consider is, in a world with a national popular vote, will third-party candidates grow a little bit, a moderate amount, or a lot? And why is this true, right? Why does the logic of this argument support that that third-party candidates are going to grow more than just like a little bit, but actually a significant amount? If you're going to make a claim that like third-party candidates are going to grow enough to win a presidential election, I think that's a pretty major claim, right? So you really need to support that. You really need to have like strong logic and reasoning as to why that's true. And you also need to have logic to explain like how many major third parties will there be, and why is that true? What kind of parties are they going to be? What kind of issues are they going to focus on, and why? So a lot of this like description of how the world is going to work requires you to have very good warranted logic, and some of that might not be able to come from like specific pieces of evidence that won't go into as far depth as you need them to. So you really need to rely a lot sometimes on your own analysis, on your own logic. And I think a lot of debaters are not very comfortable doing that, especially at tournaments like the Tournament of Champions, where it's seen that you have to have a lot of evidence and a lot of cards and etc. But I mean, I don't think that that's necessarily true. I think like evidence is always good, and it's always good to be able to back your claims. But I mean, I know that personally as a judge, I care just as much, if not more, about warranted logic behind claims. And when evidence doesn't exist for a claim, that doesn't mean that it's not true, so long as you are able to rationally support it, explain it, and weigh its significance. So again, I think like logic is going to be very, very important on this topic, especially when I think a lot of pieces of evidence on this topic give a very like facial glance at the Electoral College and the national popular vote, and kind of just list off the harms of one or the other without going really into depth about how different are these two worlds going to look like. Okay, so with that, another form of argumentation that I want to talk about is argumentation that has to do with who has influence under each system. Because I think that's definitely going to come up a lot. It's definitely going to be pretty important in routes. So I think one form of argumentation that the pro is likely going to make is that the Electoral College disproportionately benefits rural states with low populations due to the fact that each state is allotted at least 2 electoral votes regardless of their population size, which skews the influence of rural voters compared to everyone else. And I think that that is impacted out necessarily in a couple of ways. I think for one, the pro could try to say that this is principally undemocratic under some kind of like democracy framework that we've, described issues with above, but it's still possible to run. It could also be impacted by saying that these rural states are unrepresentative of the rest of the country, that they reflect the views of narrow or more radical segments of the electorate. They especially do a very poor job of representing the views of racial minorities, and perhaps the result of this is worse quality presidential candidates. Maybe it's exacerbating polarization in some form, etc. So I think that's definitely a potential argument that a lot of pro teams are going to run. I think a potential con argument, there's a couple options that con can take on the influence side. One is to defend rural interests as like critical for this country and important to focus on. And there's stuff out there about how rural populations have serious needs in terms of poverty, education, and health that really need to be addressed. Moreover, without their influence in the Electoral College, rural states would likely not have many other ways to matter significantly, as their declining population relative to urban areas means that their influence in the House of Representatives, at least, is definitely in decline, which means that like the Senate and the Electoral College are like their only ways of establishing political influence, at least on a federal level. I think another con argument is to shift the debate a bit by focusing on swing states more. And in this line of argumentation that I'm thinking of, the con would go ahead and just concede that swing states are where campaigns in the status quo are forced to disproportionately spend their time relative to the rest of the country, which pretty much gets ignored. But that this is actually a good thing because allowing for this kind of resource concentration means that swing state voters become far more informed about issues than the average voter would be under a broad national campaign. What this means is that swing states ultimately deciding the election is good because those voters are better informed and can make better decisions. So there's definitely a lot of different ways that influence arguments can be run. In addition to the pro argument I mentioned about saying that rural interests are bad, I think the pro could also make an argument about how urban interests are good and saying that if a national popular vote does put more influence in the hands of people who live in urban areas, that's beneficial because that's where the vast majority of people are moving, and that's where there are a lot of significant issues that need to be addressed, especially on a federal level, such as the affordable housing crisis, etc. But no matter how you run influence-based arguments on either side, I think you also have a lot of questions to ask yourself and answer here as well, and a lot of these as well might have to be analytically because you might not be able to find the specific or good evidence. If you can, then that's great, but sometimes people just don't think as far in depth about these kinds of issues as you would like. So we know a lot, for example, about how states have disproportionate influence, or which states rather have the most influence under the Electoral College, and how that alters campaign strategy and promises, etc. Because we see that, we've seen it in the status quo, we've seen it throughout the history through using the Electoral College. But I think it's less clear how exactly things are going to change under the national popular vote. Are candidates going to try to campaign across the entire country, or are they just going to focus on cities? Why, how, and in which states, in which cities? What does a world with the national popular vote really look like? Those are the questions that you're going to need to think about a lot in depth. And I think that's going to separate what makes good debaters from great debaters on this topic is people who do that next level of thinking, who have thought at least 5, 6, 7, 8 steps ahead and know why their argument is true at least every level. You have a lot of time probably to prepare for the April topic, and the TOC at least is at the end of the month. So what that means is I would encourage you not just to do research, not just to write a lot of blocks or to write your case. You need to do more than that. You need to do a lot of pure just sitting down and thinking sometimes. That is probably some of the best preparation you can do for the TOC is just keep asking yourself questions. And the more questions that you ask yourself, the deeper that you invite your level of knowledge to get, the deeper that you'll be able to strategize in rounds, the deeper that you'll be able to interact with potential responses that other teams can make, and by interacting your arguments against theirs at any step of the way. So, yeah, that's pretty much everything that I have to say about this topic. Again, I think it's a really interesting topic. I think it opens avenues for a discussion that could be very interesting. And we haven't had this kind of discussion all year. This topic is a little bit similar to topics we've had in the past, such as the one-day national primary topic on the Nationals topic of 2016. But we've had a lot of international topics this year. We haven't really gotten a chance to debate a domestic topic since basically September, October. So I think this is a really good opportunity with a domestic topic that really matters a lot and is definitely controversial, but I don't think it's controversial in a way that's going to affect people's biases too much unless you run extremely polarizing arguments. But I don't think you necessarily have to do that. I think there are a lot of avenues on this topic, and I just think that it's going to be a good one. I'm excited to see debates on it. So with that, remember to go get the Champion Briefs for even more than I've said here and lots of great evidence. Thanks.